So let's start with the First Amendment. So the First Amendment on the ballot focuses on the legislative veto override process. So in Louisiana, we've got kind of a unique system when it comes to veto sessions. In the Constitution, it's written that after the 40th day, it's the 40th day after adjournment, the lawmakers have to vote whether or not they want a veto override session or not. And the unique aspect of it is that they have to vote no. Otherwise, it'll automatically happen, which seems pretty unique in the situation. But Amendment number 1 is going to challenge that system. How so?
Well, basically, we got ourselves into a bind last year that we never really foresaw. We had a special session before the regular session, and it was dealing with congressional and other redistricting. The governor vetoed some of the congressional maps, and the legislature had made it clear that they wanted to override that veto. So that 40-day period that you mentioned would kick in automatically so that they could have that veto session. The problem was it happened during the regular session, which came just after. We've never had a situation where you had to try and have a veto session during a regular session. You can't really have 2 sessions at once, so it put them in a bind. What they ended up doing was voting to adjourn the regular session, have the veto session, and then come back and do the regular session. The problem is there's a big legal question as to whether you can really do that. The good thing is nobody challenged it, but what this amendment would do is say if you're going to be in another session when that 40-day period is up and you're going to have the veto session, you can do it in the session that you're in. You don't have to worry about these competing sessions.
We're going to move on to Amendment number 2. So the Second Amendment is more fiscal in nature. This one is going to be focusing on 6 different constitutional budgets that are set aside but seem to have very little money in them. Can you explain what this amendment would do and how that would change with these budgets?
Yeah, basically, we have a lot of funds in the Constitution, and by that I mean buckets where we put money. It's, a lot of times, mostly, it's dedicated to go into this fund or that fund or whatever. Well, what we have with this amendment is there are 6 of these funds that were created a number of years ago to do all kinds of good things, but they don't have any money in them. One of them has $600, but the rest have no money. So they've been inactive for a long time. So what this amendment does is basically say we're going to repeal those out of the Constitution. They're there, we're not using them, there's really no purpose for them anymore. We're just going to take them out.
And then can you give me an example of one of the budgets that's there, or one of the funds, excuse me?
Yeah, there's a couple. One deals with the Chaffalaya Basin conservation. One goes to higher ed. There's another one that deals with agricultural and seafood promotion. These were all things where dollars were intended to go in there and then use them for those specific purposes. Problem is, for the most part, they just never got the money.
Okay, so they were just sitting and collecting dust over the
and
over the
continue
years.
to.
All right, so moving on to the Third Amendment. So this is about a property tax break for first responders. It would give people, if they voted for it, if it passed, it'd give first responders a $25,000 break. Can you explain a little bit more what this amendment would actually mean?
Yeah, for most homeowners, to put it in this perspective, everybody has a homestead exemption, right? It's $75,000. What this would do if it passes would allow local governments, if they choose to create another property tax exemption on top of the homestead exemption for first responders. So people like police, fire, EMTs, that type of thing. So that would basically say instead of just the $75,000 homestead exemption, you might have $25,000 more,
wow.
So up to $100,000. Now the local government first has to decide whether to do that. So each parish would make that decision, and it's up to that amount. It doesn't have to be that amount. So the bottom line would be is that different parishes could choose to provide this tax break for property taxes, or they couldn't, or they could do it at a different amount up to that $25,000. But it's up to each parish governing authority to decide whether they want to do that.
All right, so moving on to the last amendment, which is probably the most complicated one. So it's talking about budgets, and we've got 2 major budgets whenever it comes to stabilization funds, which I think the name in and of itself is pretty self-explanatory. You want to stabilize the budget. So we've got the rainy day fund, which everyone understands, especially if you keep up with the legislature. But can you explain the second fund?
Yeah, the rainy day fund people are pretty familiar with, and it's like a savings account that can basically only be used if we are in a budget deficit situation. You can use it to balance the budget, or in certain kind of federally declared disasters, you can tap funds for that. So that's what we have. The second one was created about 2016, and it's actually got about $2 billion in it. And it was intended to do some things to stabilize the budget, but the bottom line is it was another savings account that had more flexibility than the rainy day fund. So for instance, the rainy day fund is basically limited to budget deficits. This one said if we're in some other kind of emergency, which is not defined, but the legislature could, you could tap those funds to meet the needs of that emergency. What this amendment would do is really kind of change that whole part of it. It would essentially create like two rainy day funds. So the rainy day fund is mostly geared towards budget deficits. This would be also geared towards budget deficits, not other kinds of emergencies. So for instance, if we're in a big budget deficit, you could tap the rainy day fund up to the amount that's allowable and then go into this other fund and tap it for that purpose too. But you couldn't use it for some other type of emergency that showed up, and we've had some recently in terms of things that happened during COVID and from some other old hurricane-related things. So the way it is right now, there's more flexibility, but the way that I think this amendment would take it would limit it to some very specific budget circumstances.
All right, well, thank you so much for going through all of these and explaining it for our viewers.
Oh, glad to do it.